Welcome to the Worldwide Doula podcast. I'm Berry, I'm a registered nurse and birth doula, and each week I'm joined by a new guest speaker to talk about all things pregnancy, birth, babies, and parenthood. So it's time to sit back and relax as we get into some juicy topics. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Worldwide Doula podcast. Today I'm welcoming a true power woman to my podcast. Monica has been one of my closest friends for so many years. I'm talking like early years of high school. We've been through a lot, haven't we, Mon?
Yes.
Yeah. Monica is a pilot and a mumma of a beautiful little boy. She's coming on to talk to us today about what it's like working in such a male-dominated and demanding line of work while pregnant. And then she's also going to be touching on how she tackled the challenges of returning to work after maternity leave, including things like breastfeeding, what support network she had in place to help her, and the whole shebang. Firstly, what is it like to work as a pilot and as a mum?
It's been interesting, but also really good. Like, I love being a mum and I also love being a pilot. It's brought a lot of joy into my life, having two aspects that I'm really happy with. But juggling that has definitely been interesting. But at the moment, it's been good. So, yeah, it's good.
What kind of pilot do you work as again?
I'm going into an airline in Australia. It's just a regional airline. And that's good because when you get to a bigger company, there's better processes. And I'm looking for that consistency and just somewhere that I can stay for 5 years. Because in the first part of your career, so me, like the GA, which is just general aviation, you transition through jobs very quickly because you're trying to get to a certain point, which is an airline. So at the moment, I'm in between jobs.
So can you walk us through what happened when you actually found out that you were pregnant? You were living in Darwin at the time, and like, what were your initial thoughts and feelings?
Yeah, me and Dan had been talking about having a baby, and we were sort of in those initial phases, like we just got the health insurance and there's a 12-month waiting period. So I'd been on the pill my whole young adolescent life. Like, I started when I was probably like 14, 15. And so I didn't really know what everything was going to look like. So I came off the pill and we're just like, doing the things. And I didn't really know, there's a lot of uncertainty about like, am I going to get pregnant? I don't know what my fertility is like, but I knew that if I did, even though it wasn't like on the timeline, which we were sort of thinking would be about in 12 months time, I would be ready to have a baby, like we commit to it. So we actually found out that I was pregnant only a couple of months after we sort of made that initial decision. So I was just trying to figure out what my cycle was doing. I was taking a bunch of pregnancy tests and it was just a really random, I couldn't even tell you the day, like it was just a random day on a random week, and I was sitting in bed and we were just chilling out. I was like, I'm going to go take a pregnancy test just to see, and I took the pregnancy test and I was just looking at it. Didn't even tell Dan, because every time I did one, he's like, you've got to tell me you're doing it. And I was just like checking, because we'd always look at it together. I was just checking if it was going through. You want to make sure it's actually going up. And then I was watching it and the test line came up and then this little line started to form. My initial reaction was like, oh my God. Like, I couldn't believe it. It was the most surreal thing ever. I ran into the room and I shoved it in Dan's face. I was so excited, but then also in my back of my mind, I was thinking, okay, this is a moment in time where my life is fundamentally going to change. And even though we've spoken about having babies, I've always wanted to be a mum. I knew I wanted to be a young mum in particular. I wanted to have kids in my early 20s. I was shitting bricks. Like, I was freaking out in the back of my mind. And I was just thinking, what's this going to do for my career? Because I'm in such a formative stage. What's my mum going to think?
Yeah.
What's my dad going to think? I'm not married. I come from a Christian family. But I really freaked out, and I spent probably like 24 hours after finding out, and that initial excitement with a lot of anxiety, to be honest. Like, I was really, really stressed, and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm about to have a baby, and all of the things are going through my mind. I decided to tell my mum. She was so happy. It just lifted this massive burden off my shoulders. She just said to me that everything happens for a reason and you're still going to achieve all of your goals career-wise. It just might happen in like a different order. After that, I was so happy, and it was just a really great time of my life.
My previous podcast that I've just posted, we talked a little bit about contraception, and it's interesting that you brought it up. You came off contraception, then you actively started trying, but you were not sure when it would actually happen, how soon it would happen. How long after you started trying did you find out that you were pregnant?
I think it would have been like only a couple of months. I think for me, I was uncertain with my contraceptive because I had a lot of issues when I had been off it once during like 6-year period that I was on it. I had really irregular periods, so I didn't really know what was going to happen. the pill can mask a lot of things that you
Yeah.
have going on in your system. And I just didn't want to be at that 12-month mark where we were planning we want a baby in 12 months and then not having a baby. But yes, in response to your question, it took about 3 months.
Okay, that's good.
But
That's good to know. So what were your feelings and thoughts when you actually went to go and tell your work?
To be honest, I didn't actually have any anxiety about telling my work. It was just more about navigating when to tell them,
right?
Because I didn't want to tell them too early, because obviously there's a chance of having a miscarriage, and my mum had a miscarriage before I was born. And so I just thought, I just want to keep it between me and Dan, and then I'll tell work. So yeah, I personally didn't have any anxieties about it. I just thought, oh, well, I'm pregnant, so I have rights. I'm just going to tell them and they're going to deal with it because they're a business, But I guess the stress and anxiety came later, trying to navigate maternity leave and stuff like that, because I was the first girl in the company ever to have a baby.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So I was their guinea pig, essentially, and that definitely caused a lot of tension between me and my employer. But yeah, I was fine. I ended up having to tell them a bit earlier because I had problems with morning sickness, and it was just getting to a point where I was like, it's impacting my ability to work and I need to tell them.
So obviously that was the first challenge. Were there any other challenges that you faced while working as a pilot? Because I know even flying when you're pregnant, there's certain things that you have to be careful of. Did you have any other challenges?
Yes, I'll just start with the physical one first. Obviously, morning sickness, that sucked because you're really nauseous. And I was lucky, I had it for the first 3 months, but I was able to manage it and I didn't get affected too much, but it was definitely uncomfortable. I was flying in a small aircraft at that time. It didn't have air conditioning. It was hot. Darwin is hot. If anyone doesn't know, it's 32 degrees every day during the winter. Yeah, it kind of sucked, but I was closely monitored. We have an overarching medical authority in aviation. And so we were able to manage it just with ginger tablets, and they were amazing at helping my nausea. And I was able to do shorter flights. So I was only doing them of an hour, where I was still working my full hours and doing lots of short legs. So it just meant I was able to get back on the ground, because it can be really uncomfortable. And the awareness in aviation, especially the type of aviation I was in, general aviation, you're exposed to a lot of toxic and carcinogenic chemicals. So just being really, really careful about that stuff. So always wearing gloves when I was doing fuel drains, and just being careful of what was going on to my skin and what I was around in the job was something I had to consider a lot of. And then during the second trimester, that was probably the biggest thing, because second trimester was amazing. I didn't even feel pregnant. And then when I started to get bigger, those physical things, I would have to bend over and get down to tie the plane down at the end of the day, and lifting stuff, people's heavy bags and stuff like that was a bit of a challenge. And I tried to mitigate as much risk as I could. So for example, we generally know how much stuff people have in GA. You don't just buy a seat, you actually hire in the plane. So you can have a seat for yourself, and then you can bring up to a certain amount, whatever the payload of the aircraft is. And so sometimes we'd have loads of 300 or 400 kilo stuff. It's not a problem when you're in Darwin, because you can just get the boys to load it for you. It's more when you're in a remote community, having that help there. So just making sure if I was going to pick up any heavy stuff, there would be someone there. So my work would tell the client that the pilot is pregnant, and that if they have heavy items, they need to find a way to get it into the aircraft, because I wasn't going to be lifting it. And then we're bending down and tying up the ropes. The boys generally helped me. I just tried to do as much stuff as I could, and just made sure that I stayed hydrated and stuff like that. I had a lot of problems with my work in terms of trying for them to understand the limitations when you're pregnant and navigating maternity leave and stuff like that. So that wasn't good.
So around maternity leave, how long did you have for maternity leave, and when did you start the maternity leave? What gestation were you?
I ended up taking 7 months off in maternity leave.
Was that all paid? Actual given maternity leave?
No, it was just the stuff that you get from the government.
Okay.
So there was no paid maternity leave. Like I said, I was the first woman at my company to have a baby. So there was no policy about it. So yeah, just the fair work stuff. And that's sort of why it was around the 7 month mark. And I also wanted to get back into aviation, because it's one of those industries that you need to stay in it. The longer you stay out of it, it becomes harder to get back in. And I didn't want to give up my career. And I took maternity leave at 2 weeks prior to my due date. I took it 2 weeks before my due date just because I wanted to have that nesting time, getting the place clean, and actually just having a break. But it ended up being 2 weeks later, so I had like a whole month off. It got pretty boring at the end, I'm not going to lie. I was like, get out of me. Dan only had a month off of paternity leave, and so every week was less time that Dan got to spend as support. And I was so uncomfortable. I just really, really, really wanted to meet my baby. I swear I could have just like reached into my vagina and pulled him out at that point.
Yeah, you were definitely ready. When it came, I think we were all cheering for you.
So in aviation, you've got a limit on how long you can physically fly for. I think it's like 32 or 34 weeks, and then you have to stop flying, and then you're confined to ground duties. But because one, aviation's a really heavily male-dominated industry, so we just go off Fair Work-based maternity guidance, and there's a lot of misunderstanding, and obviously small employers or like general aviation employers have like absolutely no idea how the law applies to them, and it can be really, really confusing. So my understanding was that I don't think you can be forced to take maternity leave. And I obviously couldn't fly. I was under the impression that they would just have to accommodate to me not being able to fly, but they didn't see it that way. So they thought that me not being able to fly was an operational burden in a way, because I was employed as a pilot and I couldn't fly. And revenue was like very important to this company. And so they just saw me as this person that was just wasting money. And they thought that they had found a loophole in the law that they could force me to take my maternity leave at 32 weeks or whatever the time was that I had to stop flying. And that was really stressful. I gave them heaps of notice on when I wanted to take maternity leave. I had already thought about it, and I said, hey, I sent them an email like, I'm taking my maternity leave at 38 weeks, which is this day. And they were like, that's not going to happen. So I spent like the next 6 months trying to talk to them and tell them that they can't actually do that. And it was hard because I had information from Fair Work saying, yeah, you're entitled to what they call a safe job, because I'd been there for 12 months. And if you can't do the job that you're employed to do, your employer is responsible for allowing you to do other work that's safe until the time that you want to take your maternity leave. Or if there's no safe job available, they still have to pay you until you're nominated maternity leave date. Now, interpretations of the law were different, and with Fair Work, they can't actually give you advice. So like they have an advice hotline, and they'll like tell you like, this is the law, and depending on the questions that you ask, you might be getting conflicting information. My employer went to Fair Work, and they're like, can she go on maternity leave at this time or whatever? And they were under the impression that what they were doing was legal, but they weren't. And it was really stressful because I tried to explain that to them multiple times, showing them very clearly where it was written in the law that they had to give me this safe job, and they couldn't just make me take maternity leave at 32 weeks. Because my main concern was I only have 4 months of paid leave because you don't offer it. Aviation, you don't get paid a lot. You get paid below the mean average of an Australian. Your like money is really tight, and we couldn't afford to take a year off. So the less time that I had of paid maternity leave with my child, it meant I had to go back to work earlier. I'm part of a union, and I reached out to them initially, and they gave me the wrong advice. But I just had this gut feeling that something wasn't right. Like, you shouldn't be able to do this to a woman. This is 2022 at the time.
Yeah.
And it seems to be very clear that your job is protected. You have rights. And so I was actually lucky. I have a friend who put me in contact with someone who was higher up at the union, and they were able to direct me to someone who was then more understanding of that sort of area. Because like I said, again, male-dominated industry, not a lot of people have taken maternity leave, and if they do, they do it at an airline. So there's like more clear understanding. But this person was actually a woman, and she was able to clearly say, yep, you were right. And from that point, like having that support, I was able to resolve the issue. They wrote me a letter, and it was finally resolved. But it was only like a month before I was meant to take this maternity leave that they were enforcing onto me. So I think there was some misunderstanding, but it was very, very stressful.
Yeah, so, exactly. Unfortunately, it had to be you. And that's really stressful. It's like,
it was so stressful.
It makes it so much easier when there's really clear guidelines around maternity leave and what you're allowed to take.
I guess one of my biggest pieces of advice, if you're going to have a baby in a male-dominated industry, or if you know that this is an unfamiliar terrain for your business that you work in, you need to get legal advice or like be part of a union, like an industry union who can support you through it, because it is really stressful trying to navigate it alone. And having that union, especially knowing someone in a union who deals with this a lot, like maternity leave or anything like that, it's really, really important, because like I wouldn't be surprised if someone else faced these sort of challenges, and just having someone who can legally back you and support you through it is really important. So,
yeah. Thank you for telling me that. And that's very useful advice. I'd love to talk to you about your liver.
Okay. Like, it was fine for a first-time mom. They always say, like, the first one's the hardest. It's the first time your body's doing it. So it lasted a really long time. So my water broke at like 5:30 in the morning. So strange. Apparently it happens when there's a low pressure system. So I was like one of 8 women whose waters broke that night, because there was like a low pressure system that came through.
Isn't that so interesting?
I know, I didn't know about that. But so my waters broke, and that was annoying because it started the clock on how much time I had to labor before I had to be on antibiotics. Because once your water breaks, they get concerned about the infections and stuff. And then I had planned on doing a water birth. It just meant that there was a time limit, and I just knew when they told me that I was not going to make it, and that wasn't going to happen. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I labored at home for a really long time. I think I went into the hospital at like 6:30 or something. That would have been around the 13-hour mark, and I had 5 hours from then until my dreams of a water birth would be gone.
Isn't that so sad that they put you on like a time limit? Like, I hate that about the hospital. That's what's like great about doing like a home birth, is you can do it in your own time. Obviously you need to be aware of like how long it's been, but the second you go into the hospital, they put you on a clock, and then you don't stop thinking about that clock, and it makes it harder.
To be honest, I think deep down wanted the home birth, because I just knew that it was a more enjoyable environment. I'd heard a lot of good things about it, but I was really scared of what my mum and like people around me would think. And I didn't want to put the baby at risk at all. Thought to myself, it's not about me, it's about this child. So I ended up opting to go through a more medical route, and the compromise would be that we would be in like the birthing suite. You couldn't get an epidural. Well, you could, but not in that suite. So it was all about being more natural, and there was an option for water birth. And so I was like, perfect, I get to have that sort of home birth experience, but I'm in a hospital. That's going to put all of my friends and family mind at ease. But then even though I wanted to do that, there was still a clock, because I was supervised by the hospital and my water broke. So that sort of like went out the window. But so I went to the hospital at like 6:30 because I was having contractions, and I told the doctor like how far apart they were and how long they were lasting. She was like, you need to get in here now. And she thought that I was really close to giving birth. And I got in, and I was only 2 centimeters dilated. They don't even consider that active labor. So I was like, this sucks, you know, like this really sucks.
You feel like you've been doing so much hard work, and it's like, oh, you're only 2 centimeters.
Yeah, like it was the most deflating thing ever. But so that kind of sucked. And then I think once I found that out, I was really deflated, because they say 1 hour per centimeter.
1 centimeter per hour. Which is totally unreasonable.
I've got 8 hours before I'm even ready to push. You know, I'm in for a long night.
But I mean, actually, it's funny because statistically that actually never happened.
Yeah, I'm living proof, buddy. So like my waters must have only just broken. So she broke them a little bit more, and I got like this massive intense cramping, and I was like, oh my gosh. And I had sort of decided beforehand that I wanted to do gas as well as the water birth. And so I was like, give me the gas, please. And then they gave me the gas, and it just made me so sick, like so nauseous. And I hated it, because then I've got these really intense crampings and I'm vomiting. And then I was like, I'll try the water. But they didn't tell me that the water has to be body temperature. So I like hot baths, and I get really itchy when it's not hot enough. So I was sitting in the bath, and I was like cramping, and I was itchy, and nothing was working. And I was thinking to myself, like, oh my gosh, I'm in for such a long night. So I said, can you please give me an epidural? And I was so tired at that point. And then they put it in, and they checked my cervix, and they're like, oh, you're 10 centimeters dilated. You've got to push. I was like, what? I'm 2 centimeters dilated like 2 hours ago. Like they say like the 6 to 8 centimeter mark is like really intense. So I must have been going through that time in my labor. I did all this hard work, and then I put this epidural in and I was already dilated. I couldn't believe it. And because I had it just put in, it was so strong, but I had to start pushing. And it just meant like I literally had no feeling. Like, I could not feel below my tummy. I had good mobility, but I couldn't feel anything. And I couldn't even feel like the contraction. Someone had their hands on my tummy and was like, you're having a contraction, push. You can't feel the push. So you've just got to like imagine it
and visualize it.
But you can't feel it. So in your head, you're like, I'm pushing, but you can't feel anything. So it's really weird. The epidural is amazing in the fact that it literally took away everything. But I felt super disconnected from that part because I wasn't connected to my body. Do you know what I mean? It was good. Hugo got stuck, so they had to get the vacuum, and they also had to give me
episiotomy. Yeah.
Yeah, it was definitely not what I envisioned, but it was still a beautiful birth. I was just happy to have like my little baby in my arms, and it was good because I had good mobility and stuff. I was able to like reach down and pull him out myself, and that was like really nice. I really enjoyed it.
That's good. The cascade of interventions is deadly. You know, when you get one intervention, it'll most likely lead to the next intervention and the next intervention until you have a vacuum birth with episiotomy. And
in hindsight, I wish that I didn't get the epidural, but you can't change anything, so there's no point being upset about it. You're just gonna go with it. But I think the second birth, I'll definitely decide that I'll probably do some things differently.
Now you've been through that and you've experienced what it's like to have a hospital birth, and in that situation I think that you definitely do learn. But something that you said to me the other day about the first podcast that I recorded with my mum is that it's hard not to be traumatized, and it's not necessarily always a bad trauma. It's more natural trauma that you will naturally go through no matter what kind of birth you have. Even if it's the most beautiful birth in the world and exactly how you envisioned it, you kind of go through a trauma of having that birth, and it's like natural rite of passage is becoming a mum.
Yeah, well, it's just like a really intense experience. And I think like people in general have a need to control things and plan things out. And it's such a rare thing for a birth to go exactly how you want. There's always going to be something that happens and like plans change. And I guess it's a really intense experience. And I think that, you kind of do get traumatized from it, but it's not, maybe even traumatizing isn't the right word in a way. Like, yes, you can be traumatized, but even if you're not actually traumatized, it's a massive life event that you need to process, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's an intense transition in life, which is why people hire doulas.
I think it was definitely a lot, and I did spend some time processing it, but I did have some friends as well that like through a mum's group, and that was great, just hearing their stories and realizing that we all carried some sort of trauma from our birth, and I wasn't alone. And it was so good to just hear everyone's stories.
Obviously, Dan didn't have a lot of time when the baby actually arrived, but how did you feel having that extra support? Obviously, it would have been nicer to have more time, but how did you feel having that extra support with him having paternity leave?
So Dan had 4 weeks from the government, and then he took an additional 2 weeks. So he ended up having a month at home once Hugo was born. And I think that it is so important to have your core support network, so like your partner and you during that time, because it is such a massive change. It's about the bonding experience. Like, it's just this very special time where you're in your little baby bubble and you get to bond with your partner and your new child. And I love having him around. I was so sad for him to leave because having 2 hands is way better than one. It really does take a village to raise a child. And I was better. I know. I did breastfeed. I think a lot of people do generally breastfeed, but it takes a lot of hours because they will drink for hours and hours and hours. And then you might spend 10 hours of the day with a child on your breast and you can't do anything.
Yeah, you just have to sit there and wait.
Yeah, and it's nice to have that person who can go get you water because, you get thirsty and to get food and do the cleaning. And yeah, it was great. I really liked having Dan, and he's a great dad. Like, he's super hands-on. So
how old was Hugo when you returned to work?
So he was 7 months. I was originally going to return to work when he was 6 months. I just felt when it was approaching that time, I felt like he wasn't ready. 7 months was probably the youngest I would have put him into daycare. And I guess I do know that I come from a place of privilege to be even able to take those 7 months. To be honest, after the whole process at my old company of the maternity leave, it was not pleasant and I wanted out So I interviewed for other jobs in Darwin and I was a good candidate, but a big sticking point was that I was asking for part-time because I couldn't go back full-time because I had no support. And it just didn't really work operationally for them. So I went back 3 days a week at my other job. And it was pretty interesting. After like the whole incident with my maternity leave, I was pretty firm on my requirements. I said I didn't want to do anything over an hour flight because I needed to be close. That's how I sort of made it work with my job. They were really good. Once everything happens, they sort of realized that it's bad for business to not look after your employees. And my other co-workers weren't blind, so they knew that they had to be good and be accommodating for me. And there was definitely pushback. It did come with its challenges, but they were good.
Transitioning back into the workplace after a baby can be a lot of emotional stuff. I've heard a lot of women say that they felt like a separation anxiety from their baby. Did you feel that way too?
Like I worried and thought about him a lot, but I was aware that women can experience that. So I just tried to mitigate that as much as I could. We chose a daycare that was at the airport. So I knew that just down the road from him, Darwin's pretty small, so you don't have to travel very far. So even though he was at daycare, I was only a minute drive down the road and I could see him if I needed to, pop in if I needed to. I did get nervous when I was flying, like when I actually left Darwin to go on a flight. I definitely was really anxious during that time because I knew that I couldn't be there for him immediately, and that formed like a lot of anxiety. But you have to compartmentalize when you're flying, like you can't think about it. So I guess it was a good in that way. So I didn't have the space for those thoughts to be in my mind. I needed to focus on flying and the task at hand. So it was really good in that regard, because when I was in the office I was nice and close, and when I was flying I couldn't even think about it. But I definitely felt guilty though for sending him so young.
Yeah. As you said before, some people can't access that and it's just too expensive for them. So it's good that you had that option. What kind of support did you have when you were in Darwin? You mentioned that you had some friends and you had support groups.
So I had my friend, obviously, so that midwife, she was really involved in Hugo's early life. And I also had a girlfriend from work who was amazing. She'd just come over all the time and just hold Hugo so I could have a shower and stuff like that. Because obviously Dan was back at work and that can be really challenging to get those like basic things. I was so appreciative of that. And then I had a mum's group, which I was in Darwin, and that was amazing. Socializing with people who had babies. I actually was really sad to leave Darwin because we caught up every week and it was something to do and it was just the best. Like I love my mum's group. They really brought a lot of support and like happiness and just like something to do, something other than feeding, changing and sleeping a child. You need that social interaction, and that was great. And then my mum visited for like 2 weeks and our neighbours were amazing as well. I had support, but I didn't have people who could take Hugo for hours. So I didn't have that actual support besides daycare. And with my job, I needed that. And so did Dan. And it was either one of us leaves the industry to provide that support, or we move somewhere that has that support, because I wanted to return back to work full time.
It's actually crazy how we underestimate how powerful it is for somebody just to come and hold your baby just while you go to the toilet, because when it's just you at home with the baby, you have to take it everywhere. They're like stuck to you all the time.
Yeah. And also Hugo had reflux and it meant that he was an unsettled baby and we could not put him down. We rocked him to sleep every night. During his waking hours, he was up on us because he was so uncomfortable when he lied down. That made it really challenging. So I just really appreciated that support from people. You know, the gifts and stuff are nice and they do help, and I'm always so grateful. But the greatest gift you can give is your time, coming to their house and just letting them have that sacred space of being able to wash your hair by yourself and sit down and I guess like have a moment to reset and not feel touched out or anything, because that can happen. I really appreciated when people did that for me.
That's a good point. If any one of your friends is pregnant and having a baby soon, give her some time, because that is something that I've heard a lot of recently. Yeah.
And if you come over, like bring the tea, coffee, biscuits, like come over to help and make them a cup of tea, bring some food. Like my friend who came over, she would always bring me snacks. And as a new mum, like you have a right to be selfish, and for your friends to know that and to be so accommodating and help you during that time, it's amazing. And it really shows you who your friends are.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes it's nice to reach out, just say, hey, do you need anything? Because so many mums fall into feeling really isolated, and it's definitely an isolating time when the dad or the partner goes back to work and the mum's left alone at home and she doesn't actually have any friends or family around. Taking time to go and even just call her if you're not close by, or just flying up there for a week or something just to stay with her can make a huge difference, because there's so much depression or really isolating feelings, and that's the last thing that you need when you've just had a baby. Let's move on to breastfeeding, because I think that's something that new mums returning to work find really difficult. And especially when you see it in the movies, like the mum going to the closet to go and pump because she's too embarrassed. Did you breastfeed when you returned to work, or were you still breastfeeding then?
Yeah, so I breastfed Hugo for 15 months. That was one of my goals. When I put my mind to something, I am pretty good at achieving it. And I said to myself, if my body allows it, I am breastfeeding this baby exclusively. And I really, really wanted to do that because Dan's uncle, he's a doctor and he works in developing formulas. And he said like they cannot replicate how many nutrients go into like the breast milk for your child. And I just knew that it was the best thing I could give him. I really, really wanted to do that. And I decided that if I could, I was doing it. I was really, really firm about it at work. And I just told them, like, I'm breastfeeding, I'm going to be pumping, and you're going to make a space for me to pump, and that's it. Like, there's no other alternative. So they did have like a room. It wasn't like a closet or anything. Like, it was a break room, and they put a sign up. They installed blinds. I think there was like a joke, like I had like a cow with milk bottles underneath it or something, like milking in progress or something. It was a bit interesting at my job in Darwin because I was doing a lot of flying as well. And there were times where I had to actually pump in the plane, but I was by myself. So on like an empty leg, I just whip out the breast pump and pump in the plane. That was definitely interesting.
Yeah. As a new mum who's fairly young, did you have support with breastfeeding? Because I know that a lot of mums are like, I'm going to breastfeed, and then they don't actually know how to do it. And it's really painful. Their breasts get really chapped and they end up just being like, oh, it's too hard, and stop. Like, lack of education is the number one thing that stops mums from breastfeeding and continuing breastfeeding.
Yeah, well, like, just like a side note, that is the one thing about the hospital that I really freaking hate, is that there's all this support while you're pregnant. Then you have your baby and you have like a couple of checkups and they're like, have fun. And then you have no support. You're just making it up, right? Yeah. And so this is one of the gifts of modern technology and my Instagram. There are so many Instagram accounts that will explain to you breastfeeding and give you advice. And they've got big platforms. So pretty much any question that you could have, they've already answered. And I really leaned into parenting account to help me with breastfeeding. I was actually really lucky. Hugo fed really, really well. So I never had any problems with bleeding or chapped nipples. But one thing I really did focus on when I started breastfeeding was latch. Nailing the latch, because it shouldn't hurt to breastfeed. And that's what all of the Instagram forums are saying. There's so much information. You just look up Google, like, what should a latch look like? And getting that nailed was probably a big key to successfully doing it, because I didn't have any pain. And if it hurt, I just unlatched him. If he wasn't latched properly, I just unlatch him and get him to relatch. But yeah, I didn't really have a lot of support in that regard. Like, I literally just had Instagram. It was all self-support.
A lot of mums are like, oh, it hurts so much, so I only managed to do it for like 6 months. 6 months of painful breastfeeding. It's already like so a full-time job as it is.
Oh, if it hurt, I would have stopped at like 2 weeks because it, like, that is not comfortable. It's just crazy that they don't have support. I guess you can see a lactation expert. They did have that at the hospital, but I didn't need it.
You're a trooper. 15 months is a long time to breastfeed.
I think by the end of it, I was pretty ready. Like I said to myself, 12 months and then I'm good. And then it got to 12 months and I just really felt like Hugo wasn't ready. You know, that mama instinct, that was his way of soothing. And so if he was upset, he got fed. And that's how he learned to soothe. And he didn't really have any other coping mechanisms. And with the reflux, I didn't want to pull him off. It didn't feel right. And so I just waited until he was old enough to have different coping mechanisms. And at that point, he he didn't need my breast to fall asleep. He was able to be held, and being held and soothed was a lot more successful. And we just knew he wasn't very interested in breastfeeding. He was pulling off. He wasn't asking for it. And yeah.
Mm-hmm. So he kind of did baby-led weaning.
Yeah, like I waited until he was ready. And I think like it's one of those things you know.
It's good to know how you navigated that, because I think that's something very difficult for new mums. Is there anything that you would do differently regarding your maternity leave or returning to work now that you look back?
I'm happy with what I did, because at the end of the day, I do think that things do happen for a reason. And I needed to go back to work at 7 months. I felt bad, but Hugo, he was fine. We were so lucky with the daycare. They were amazing. I was really craving that social interaction. Like, yes, I had that mum's club, but like I said at the beginning, I love flying and I wanted to do it again. And I was mindful of not letting my recency expire. Had goals. Like, I really wanted to get into an airline and get to a point that my hours were secure so that it like opened up a lot of jobs. I wouldn't take back. I'm happy. I think Hugo benefited from taking 7 months leave. But I think now that I'm in a different place in my life and my career, my next baby, I'll probably take an extended period, like a year. Or something like that, because they're so small and you just love them. And it's not even just about that. Like, it is such a special time in your life. You will never get that time back.
Yeah.
And I'm much more comfortable in my career. I'm happy where I am, and I'm happy to just take a bit more time off to spend really absorbing all of that baby goodness, because I probably won't have another one after my second child. So I'm like, I need to experience it all. It's so precious, and you'll never get that time back. So
yeah. How old is he now?
He's almost 2.
So exciting. He's growing up so fast.
I know. And that's the thing, like, they grow up so fast.
Yeah.
You know, depending on the industry. So like in nursing, it's such a high percentage of women in that workforce. So of course, maternity leave is so important to them, and that support. So they're going to have like fantastic support network. Whereas like in aviation, it's male dominated. So that support is less. But the industry is changing, where they've realized that women are entering this industry, and there's going to be people who get pregnant. And what's happening now, they're realizing that they actually need to give men more paternity leave to support the mum to transition back into work. And having that flexibility of being able to take the reins. When they're really young, they really rely on their mum, and it's just like a biological thing.
Yeah.
Like, you have to take that time. But there does become a point where other people can look after your child and step in. But I think the industry and just like Australia in general is starting to realize that. So there has been like some changes in the policies.
I think it's so important to have the paternity leave aspect, because mums are left at home and they're too scared to talk about how they're feeling, or they have just no idea how they're feeling. And that's how postpartum depression actually starts. It's better to prevent it before it actually happens, because I mean, postpartum depression is intense. So anyway, that was a dark note to finish that off. It's been so great talking to you about this, and thank you for telling me your story. Actually, I loved hearing it.
It's good that you're doing this, and it was nice to just like talk to someone like my friend. None of my friends are having kids, but it's nice to talk to like a friend who is like interested in the space and has questions.
Yeah, there's so many things that I'd love to talk to you about. So you're definitely going to be coming back on the podcast. If you're enjoying the podcast, make sure you give us a follow and rate our show so that we can spread the word and educate more mamas and women worldwide. And we will see you next Monday for another juicy episode. For more information on pregnancy, birth and parenthood, head over to my website or Instagram at blissfulbirth.co. And just a little reminder, the information contained in this podcast is here to educate and empower, and does not replace the advice of your own healthcare provider.